Intel Core is facing criticism in China after it asks suppliers not to use Xinjiang labor or products, threatening to ensnare the US chipmaker in a dispute over human rights in the far western Chinese region. Users on the Twitter-like Weibo service this week posted a letter sent by Intel in December that said it's required to ensure its supply chain didn't employ labor or procure goods and services sourced in Xinjiang. The nationalist news site Guanxia accused the chipmaker of siding with Western governments, which have imposed restrictions on products from the region. A hashtag on the topic has generated more than 250 million views in Weibo. The United States has accused China of widespread human rights abuses in Xinjiang, home to the country's mainly Muslim Uyghurs, including forced labor. Beijing has repeatedly denied the claims. Intel's letter on the company's website and in several languages sparked fuzz in China from state and social media with calls for a boycott. In a Chinese language statement on Thursday on its official WeChat and Weibo accounts, Intel said that its commitment to avoid supply chains from Xinjiang was an expression of compliance with US law rather than a statement of its position on the issue. But there was a twist waiting for all of us. US semiconductor giant Intel Core apologized for the letter they sent suppliers asking them to avoid sourcing from the Chinese region of Xinjiang, where the Chinese government has conducted a campaign of forcible assimilation against religious minorities. In a letter to global suppliers, dated this month and published in several languages on its website, Intel called on its business partners to steer clear of the remote northwestern region of China, noting that multiple governments have imposed restrictions on products sourced from the Xinjiang region. Therefore, Intel is required to ensure our supply chain doesn't use any labor or source goods or services from the Xinjiang region. Intel said in its statement, which was posted on its social media platforms in China, "We deeply apologize for the confusion caused to our respected Chinese customers, partners, and the public." Later Thursday, Intel said in a statement that it had posted its apology in China to address concerns raised by our stakeholders there regarding how we communicated certain legal requirements and policies with our global supplier network. The company said it would ensure its sourcing complies with relevant rules wherever it operates, but Intel didn't specify which law it was seeking to comply with. By late Thursday, Intel's apology was among Weibo's top trending topics, with more than 340 million views. The issue drew comments from users who criticized the American chipmaker for what they described as Intel's lack of sincerity. The Intel letter was published in the US on December 16th, the same day that the US Senate passed legislation banning imports from the Xinjiang region over concerns about the use of forced labor. President Biden signed the bill, titled the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, into law on Thursday. The US and the other Western governments have sought to punish Beijing over its policies towards Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities in Xinjiang, which US government officials, lawmakers, and human rights activists have said amount to genocide. It also comes just weeks ahead of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. Intel is one of 114 global companies that have contracts with the International Olympic Committee to sponsor multiple Olympics. Human rights groups have put pressure on Olympic sponsors to speak up on human rights or pull out ahead of the Beijing Games, which are slated to begin February 4th. At a congressional hearing over the summer, Intel General Counsel Steve Rogers said the company had no goods sourced from the Chinese region and put in place policies to prohibit suppliers from being added from there. At the hearing, he also said Intel had spoken out to the IOC of the importance of human rights to the company. Researchers say China's government has detained as many as 1 million members of mostly Muslim minorities in a network of internment camps as part of a campaign of forcible assimilation that also includes mass surveillance, forced labor, and stringent birth controls. China's government has rejected those allegations, portraying its campaign in Xinjiang as an innovative effort to fight religious extremism and terrorism. Social media analysts analyzing trends and disinformation analyzing Chinese activity have found Communist Party-run news outlets often amplify nationalist Chinese social media campaigns. After H&M and sports apparel maker Nike Inc. was hit earlier in the year over their expressions of concern about forced labor in Xinjiang, researchers in Taiwan found state media outlets and Communist Party-affiliated social media accounts fanning the flames of anger online. They also claimed a boycott against foreign apparel brands leaves Chinese consumers with a plethora of domestic offerings, while in Intel's case, there aren't any clear-cut Chinese alternatives. A Chinese crackdown on Intel chip imports could have big implications for the country's industry. The US semiconductor giant has more than 80% market share in so-called CPU chips for desktop personal computers, the brains of the PC. It's also a dominant vendor of such processors for data services, supplying such Chinese companies as Alibaba Group Holding Limited. China was Intel's largest market by revenue from 2018 to 2020. The company in its latest annual report said it had around $20 billion in revenue linked to sales in the country, or about 26% of that year's total. Some of those sales are to customers who then export their goods from China. Intel also maintains several offices in China and a chip assembly and test facility in Chengdu. More than a decade ago, Intel made a splash when it announced it would put a chip-making plant in Dalian. Chinese regulators this week signed off on Intel selling that facility that now makes memory chips to South Korea's SK Hynix Inc. in a deal agreed to last year. Intel's continuing access to the Chinese market is crucial to its growth as it struggles with increasing competition. China is the largest consumer of semiconductors in general and the biggest marketplace for personal computers, the main destination for Intel's microprocessors. The chipmaker derived more than a quarter of its 2020 revenue from the country. The Santa Clara, California-based company is increasingly dealing with geopolitical tensions that make its place in the global supply chain more difficult to maintain. Intel wants US and European government money to help fund its expansion plans at a time when its home country is increasingly at odds with China. As recently as last week, the Biden administration was considering options to increase sanctions against Chinese chipmakers as part of a push to prevent the world's most populous country from strengthening its domestic chip industry. Western governments, including the US, have accused Beijing of employing forced labor in Xinjiang, including in the cotton industry, and imposed sanctions over alleged human rights abuses. China has repeatedly dismissed the allegations as lies and retaliated with sanctions on its own. Before this spat erupted, Wang had been a brand ambassador for Intel. TF Boys has performed multiple times at CCTV's Lunar New Year Gala and other national holiday celebrations, suggesting the band enjoys the government support. The 22-year-old Wang, who also goes by the English name Carrie, had cut ties with Dolce & Gabbana in 2018 after the Italian brand posted a video deemed by many to denigrate Chinese people. As of Thursday morning, Wang had more than 80 million fans in Weibo. The whole incident is the latest example of multinational companies caught in the middle as Western governments pressure companies to disentangle their supply chains from Xinjiang. Sportswear company Adidas AG and fast fashion giant H&M Hens and Moritz AB are among those that have run afoul of social media users in China. Those that have apologized to Chinese consumers, meanwhile, risk a backlash from lawmakers and consumers back home. Earlier this year, H&M has wiped off China's internet after the Swedish company said it would stop sourcing from Xinjiang. A Chinese consumer boycott followed, costing the fashion company some $74 million in lost sales in China for the 3 months ended May 31st. Other consumer brands, including Adidas and Nike, also suffered a decline in China sales after joining a consortium of Western brands that raised concerns over alleged forced labor practices in Xinjiang.